The adventure in your life will be found in responsibility. No one ever hears that. We haven't told young people that for like 60 years. It's in the difficulty. It's in the responsibility. It's not in the hedonistic self-gratification that, as I said, won't even satisfy a 2-year-old, not in the final analysis.
Why do you think so many people are lost, and why are they missing the direction that they need to?
Well, I think I know why. Because I've watched crowds of thousands of people hundreds of times respond to certain things I've said investigating that problem. Since 1960, we've insisted that the purpose of your life is a kind of hedonistic happiness, that you have rights, which includes the rights to that hedonistic happiness. The capitalist marketers certainly capitalize on that just as much as the, governmental tyrants. Rights, rights, rights. What I want right now. That idea of infantile consumption, fundamentally. Well, you have rights for a particular reason, and the reason you have rights is so that you can shoulder your responsibilities. And you might say, well, I don't want to shoulder my responsibilities. But that's where all the meaning in your life is. And so when I tell people this, the audiences always go dead silent. It's like, the adventure in your life will be found in responsibility. No one ever hears that. We haven't told young people that for like 60 years. You pick up the cross and shoulder it uphill because that's where all the meaning in your life will be derived from. It's in the difficulty. It's in the responsibility. It's not in the hedonistic self-gratification that, as I said, won't even satisfy a 2-year-old, not in the final analysis. All you do is, if people just get what they want all the time, immediately, it's not like that ennobles their character. Like, obviously not. Your character is made noble by sacrifice, by the delay of gratification. That's all associated with maturity. And the community itself is a sacrificial. The community itself requires sacrifice on the part of the individual. Obviously, like, to be in a community is to sacrifice your individuality to the community. It's the definition of community. You don't get everything you want the second you want it in your marriage. You have to take the other people into account. Well, that's a sacrifice of immediate gratification. Now, you might say, well, it's a good long-term deal. It's like, yeah, that's kind of the point. It's a good long-term deal. So you sacrifice the idiot present for a good long-term deal, a good communal long-term deal. And if you do that properly, then you have a stellar reputation, right? Because you're someone who can be counted on, relied upon. And then that also is something that provides your life with meaning. We're lost because we have no direction. We don't even believe that there is such a thing as direction. And then you might say, well, what's the proper direction? The direction of maximal voluntary self-sacrifice. That's the proper direction. Every military person knows that. It's the core of the military enterprise. And there's obviously adventure in that. There can be catastrophe in it as well. But
I wanted to also elaborate on what you were saying at the event on pride and how pride can trigger all of the negative emotions, depression, anxiety. You went down the list, and could you please explain how that works? And because when you were talking about it up there, I had thought about a lot of the times that I'd felt anger or regret or resentment. And a lot of that was when I refused to, it was my ego. It was my ego getting in the way.
Okay, so I should return to one thing we discussed. So I discussed that self-authoring program. You'd asked me about lies and how people get out of it. Mm-hmm. Well, one way you get out of your web of lies is to replace it with a truthful story. And that has to cover your whole life, right? Past, present, and future. And so you retool your life if you want to escape from your web of lies. And you try to do that by laying out what happened as clearly as you possibly can, right? With no You lay out the unvarnished truth, and there's going to be real pain in that. This is a treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder, for example. So if the terrible thing that happened is in the past, because you don't want to do this if it's too soon. You have these psychologists who rush in to schools during a shooting and have the kids talk about it. All that does is make it worse. Like, it's a traumatic event. If you dwell on it while it's happening, it makes it worse. Now, if it's something that's 5 years distant and still a hot memory, it's something that has to be confronted. Then you go and write it down in painful detail and try to assess exactly what happened and why you acted the way you acted. And that can be curative, but that's painful. It's painful in the short term. And the research on these sorts of programs shows that if you have people write about a traumatic experience, let's say, that it worsens their mood in the short term. It's not surprising. That's why they want to avoid thinking about it to begin with. But the long-term consequences are positive. So if you've encountered something traumatic, it's like there's an abyss in your life and you'd fallen into it. And the reason you're still upset about that is because you don't know why you fell into it. And so your brain, your mind, your soul is warning you. It's like, you fell into a pit, buddy, and you don't know why. And so you could fall into it again. And so I'm not going to let you forget it. You have to figure out why you fell into that pit. And if you've done something particularly terrible, then that's a very deep pit. And that's very, very hard on people. It's very common for soldiers, for example, to develop post-traumatic stress disorder when they watch themselves do something they can't believe they could do. And it flips their understanding of themselves upside down. They don't know who they are. And they also don't know who other people are. And they don't know what the world's like. It's not what they thought it was, that's for sure. And there's a lot more to them on the dark side, let's say, than they could have ever imagined. It's like, that's definitely the case. Well, how do you come to terms with that? You come to terms with that fundamentally. The deeper the trauma, the more a religious approach is necessary. Because if you're traumatized, you're in the landscape of good and evil. Right? You're traumatized by an encounter with evil. It's not mere tragedy. It's not just that something bad happened to you. Bad things happen to people all the time without them being traumatized. Usually if someone's traumatized, they've been bit by malevolence. Might be their own, might be someone else's. They've been bit by malevolence. They don't know what to do with that. They don't know what to do with the reality of evil. One of the things you do with the reality of evil is start to understand the mythological landscape, and that is the landscape of good and evil. And then you have to start to understand what good means and what the pathway back there is. Part of the religious enterprise, the Christian enterprise, deals with this very forthrightly. It's like people can wander very badly off the path and end up in places they can't tolerate being. How do you get back? Confess. Repent. Atone. That's exactly right. What's the confession? Well, what do you do? Everything. What do you do? Okay? Repent. Well, could you set yourself up so you wouldn't do that again? How would you have to change yourself, the way you look at the world, so that you don't fall into that pit again? Atone. What do you have to do to make it good, to make it right?
No matter where you're watching Sean Ryan Show from, if you get anything out of this, please like, comment, subscribe, and most importantly, share this everywhere you possibly can. And if you're feeling extra generous, please leave us a review on Apple and Spotify podcasts.